So now we want to think of a potential confounding variable, definition over here on the left-hand side, that might explain this weird happening, right? Because it doesn't make sense to say that the sellout crowd caused them to play worse. That flies in the face of what home court advantage is all about. Normally, we say playing at home in front of your home crowd actually makes you play better, and that's why we say there's a home court advantage. So number 5 says, can we figure out or think of an alternative variable that might explain why the team would be less likely to win in front of a sellout crowd, and make sure it's clear not just that your explanation would affect the likelihood of winning, but also explain why they would be less likely to win in front of a sellout crowd. So I'm going to say, and this is kind of answering 5 and 6 together, the quality of their opponent. Maybe they played better opponents when there was a sellout crowd. And of course, they'd be more likely to lose if they played a better opponent. And if I'm saying more likely to lose, could also say less likely to win. So if they're playing a better quality team, then they might be more likely to have a sellout crowd and less likely to win the game. So again, I feel like I've kind of already answered number 6. Identify the confounding variable, opponent quality. Explain how it's confounding. What is the link between this and the response in the explanatory? And I believe I did that in number 5. So the confounding variable would be the opponent quality, right? And the link between that and the explanatory is tends to be a sellout crowd maybe when they play a better opponent, and the association with the response is they'd probably be more likely to lose or less likely to win with a higher quality opponent. So I'm just going to say I think I answered that. All right, so number 7, it tells us up above there, they did record whether or not the opponent had a winning record. So they're going to call strong opponents versus weak opponents. So when they had their 41 home games, 22 were against strong opponents, and 13 of those were sellouts. They played 19 games against what we'll call weaker opponents. They had won less than half their games that season, and only 5 of those were sellouts. So number 7 says, was the Thunder more likely to have a sellout crowd against a strong opponent or a weak opponent? So against a strong opponent, the proportion of sellout crowds was 13 out of 22, which if you get a decimal for that is 0.591. And again, make sure you can get the decimal yourself. Against weak opponents, the proportion of sellouts they had was 5 out of 19. They had 19 games against weak opponents at home, and 5 out of 19 is 0.263. So those are different percentages, right? So there appears to be an association. An association between the strength of their opponent and whether or not they had a sellout crowd. Okay, then in number 8, we're going to compare whether or not they won against strong opponents versus weak opponents. So they give us the numbers there and ask us, was the Thunder less likely to win against a strong opponent than a weak one? So I guess we should say in answer to question number 7, yes, their probability of sellout crowd against a strong opponent was almost 60%, against a weak opponent only 26%, so they were more likely to have a sellout crowd against a strong opponent. Okay, so when they played a strong opponent, they won 4 of 22 games. So again, let's just break this down. Against a strong opponent, their proportion of wins is 4 out of 22, and that is 0.182. Again, make sure you can get these decimals in yourself. When they played against a weak opponent, their proportion of wins was 11 out of 19. Of course, they do better against the weaker opponents, and that is 0.579 as a decimal. So the answer to the question here, again, is yes. Their win proportion against strong opponents is much lower than against weak opponents, which again should make common sense to you. So there appears to be an association between the quality of the opponent and the game result, whether or not they won.